Hey guys, you'll be taking a look at the 2022 Senate map based on the latest polls alone, and so polls may not always be super accurate, but they are really not that far off most of the time. 5% would be a big deviation from polls to actual results, and so if you look at the latest numbers for the Democratic Party, they really have been very favorable, so favorable that if Democrats lost any of these races, the polls would have to be unprecedentedly wrong, and if you look at the generic ballot, Democrats have retaken the lead, so the newest numbers that we're seeing for the Senate elections are reflective of the changes in the national environment. And so on this map, I already have all of these solid states filled in for both parties. Yes, in some states like Washington, Connecticut, as well as Missouri, the polling data does not suggest a solid race, but in the end, the incumbents here are going to win pretty easily, so it really does not matter if we talk about them or not. But in these 12 toss-up races, these are the races that are going to be the most competitive and the ones that really could go both ways for the two parties. And so I'm going to start off with Nevada and move from left to right. Alright, so starting off with the Silver State, we have an election between Catherine Cortez Masto and Adam Laxalt. Masto is, of course, running for her re-election to a second term after succeeding Harry Reid 6 years ago. And Adam Laxalt is, of course, the 2018 Republican gubernatorial nominee that lost to Steve Sisolak. So looking at the polls between the two candidates, we do see a very close race. The polls here are actually some of the closest that we have this year. And if you look at all of the most recent polls, Cortez Masto is significantly ahead. And so right now, I think that Masto is doing much better than I thought at this point in time, and Adam Laxalt is proving to be a weaker and weaker nominee day by day. I mean, his popularity in the state is not going up, and as an incumbent, Masto does have a significant advantage. Fundraising is probably one of the biggest ones, with Catherine Cortez Masto having out-fundraised Adam Laxalt by over 10 points. And so if we look at the state of Nevada right now, according to the polls, 1.5% margin, it of course is going to be lean for the Democratic Party. And next up in Nevada, Mike Lee is only up by 9.2% against Evan McMullin. Now, in the end, I do believe that Republicans are going to outperform expectations. I think a solid margin is possible for the Republican incumbent, but I mean, this is a big difference from what we saw in 2016. 6 years ago, Mike Lee won his first election by 41% against Misty Snow. This time on, Evan McMullin is posing a very strong challenge, and this is probably going to be the most competitive Senate election in modern Utah history. Democrats never have a chance in this election, but Evan McMullin, an independent candidate, was endorsed by the Democratic Party in Utah, and so that is why he is doing so well, because Democratic voters are going to back him, as well as many independents, and of course even many Republicans that are not so supportive of the former president as Mike Lee is. So even if Republicans elect Evan McMullin, he is still likely to caucus with the Republicans more than the Democrats, because of course McMullin is still ideologically a conservative. And so if we look at the latest polls at 9.2%, this means that Utah is not even going to be near a solid state. It's actually going to be closer to lean than it is to solid, but of course Utah is going to be likely here on our map. And moving on south to Arizona, we have the election between Mark Kelly and Blake Masters. Kelly running for his first full term after being elected in the 2020 special election against Martha McSally. A good finish for Democrats. Mark Kelly then, of course, became the second senator from the state of Arizona following Kyrsten Sinema. And so if we look at this year's race, Blake Masters has proven to be a pretty weak campaigner, really not somebody that is energizing voters as much as he should be. And Arizona should be one of the easier flips for the Republican Party. If you look at our map, the four easiest flips for the GOP should be Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, and New Hampshire. Right now, definitely Nevada is the race that Republicans are doing the best in, but still, they're not even leading in the polls. And in Arizona and Georgia, we're going to look at the numbers in these two states later. The Republican Party is getting absolutely pummeled. So if we look at the Arizona polls, Mark Kelly leads by a margin of 10.2% on average against Blake Masters. He is at 51.1%, and if you look at every single poll, basically Mark Kelly is up by double digits. If you look at the 2020 polls for his race against McSally 2 years ago, Mark Kelly did pretty similarly in the polls. Actually, he's doing better now than he was 2 years ago, but Democrats are likely to underperform expectations here in the state of Arizona. But in the end, I think that a 10-point margin is just too much for Democrats even to underperform. Even if Mark Kelly had a very bad day, he would still come out on top in this race. So of course, the state of Arizona is going to be likely for the Democrats based on the polls. Next up, in Colorado, Michael Bennet leads by 13% in the only poll release between him and Joe O'Dea. Bennet was first appointed in 2009 and re-elected in both 2010 and 2016. And so even though Joe O'Dea is more moderate of a Republican, it really is going to be very difficult for him to actually win this race. Bennet, of course, outperformed Hillary Clinton's margin in 2016, winning by over 5%. And so if you look at the race this year, I think a very similar margin is very likely. I do think that Michael Bennet may even do better than he did last time, as of course he's gotten to know Colorado voters more and more over the last 6 years. He is not that charismatic of a candidate, but he is somebody that definitely can win. Republicans are not going to flip a state that Joe Biden won by 14% just 2 years ago, even if there is supposedly a red wave. And of course in 2020, we saw the election of John Hickenlooper, who defeated Cory Gardner, the Republican incumbent that was elected in 2014. And so on our map, Colorado is going to be the second likely state for Democrats, surprisingly, after the state of Arizona. And so now we have the western half of the U.S. done, and we're going to move on to the 8 remaining races that we have in the East. Starting off with Iowa, Chuck Grassley is running for his 8th term in office, and Michael Franken is the Democratic challenger. He is a former Navy Vice Admiral, and Grassley is the eldest member of the Senate currently of the Republican Party, and Patrick Leahy is, of course, retiring. So after this election, Chuck Grassley will become the senior-most member of the U.S. Senate, and if you look at his margins over the last 2 decades, his margins have become weaker and weaker as he's gotten older, and the state of Iowa has not shifted any bit to the left. It's only gone significantly to the right. In 2016, Grassley won his 7th term by 24%. In 2010, it was a margin of 31% for his 6th term, and all the way back in 2004, Chuck Grassley won by 42%. So Iowa has been shifting away from Chuck Grassley. He's still a very strong Republican. They're still very popular, but definitely we might see a very close election this time around. According to the polls, Grassley only leads by 8 and 5%. So on average, he's only up by a margin of 6%, and I can only categorize Iowa barely as a likely GOP state. And next up in Wisconsin, Ron Johnson is actually down in the polls against Mandela Barnes. Barnes just recently won the Democratic nomination for this race, and Ron Johnson is one of the most unpopular senators in the country. And so Mandela Barnes does stand a chance, but still, this is Wisconsin, a state that Joe Biden barely flipped in 2020, and with that type of margin, it will be very difficult for the Barnes campaign. This poll is favorable to them. It is an AB rated pollster, but I mean 2% in one poll, it really does not mean too much. Ron Johnson is still very likely to win his re-election. 70-30 that he does come out on top, but according to the polls right now, the state of Wisconsin is going to be lean for the Dems. And so now we have just 2 more races left in the Midwest, and of course in Ohio, this is the one that Democrats desperately want to win. It would be a major flip for their party. Of course, in 2016, Rob Portman won re-election by 21% against Ted Strickland, and this time around, we're seeing J.D. Vance as the Republican nominee, somebody that is pretty weak compared to Tim Ryan. Tim Ryan is definitely a very electable candidate, but the natural environment simply does not favor him. I think that if he ran in a year like 2020 against J.D. Vance, Tim Ryan would probably win this race, although it would still be very, very close. Looking at the polls, though, Tim Ryan does lead by 4.5%, but these polls really have not been the best. I mean, most of them do not even have a rating, and if they do, it's either B or C. However, J.D. Vance has not led in any poll conducted since all the way back in May, so it is still pretty interesting. And even if we do look at the SurveyMonkey polls, in May, Vance was leading in 2 of them. However, now, Tim Ryan leads by double digits in all 3 of them, and of course, SurveyMonkey does these polls basically every single month or so. So the trends here are pretty abysmal for the Republican Party of Ohio, but as of right now, Tim Ryan is still probably going to lose even if polls show him ahead. But on our map, we're going to base it solely on polling data, so it is going to be a lean state, almost a likely state though, and that just goes to show you just how well polling is going right now for Democrats in the state. And in the Keystone State of Pennsylvania, John Fetterman leads by 10.8% against Mehmet Oz. I mean, this is another race that Republicans should be winning in. They currently hold this seat. It would be a disaster if they lost it to Fetterman. Mehmet Oz, though, is very likely to actually end up not winning his term in the U.S. Senate. In 2016, we saw the very close election of Pat Toomey to a second term. He will not be running again. However, Mehmet Oz is a big mistake for the Republican Party. His nomination was definitely one of the weakest ones. once. He barely defeated David McCormick, so John Fetterman is in a good position going into this race. I mean, just look at the polling numbers. Yes, polls in Pennsylvania have been known to be inaccurate. They have been known to overestimate Democrats. They definitely did that in the 2020 presidential election as well as other races in the past. However, it really is not that significant in midterm years, and Democrats have never underperformed by over 10%, not even close to that. We've seen underperformances of 4 to 5%, and then that's basically it. A 10% underperformance would be significant, and that is almost impossible to happen. The polls simply do not get it that wrong, especially in a close race like Pennsylvania. So on our map, of course, the Keystone State is going to be likely for the Democratic Party. And now looking at the only competitive election in New England, we of course have the Senate race in New Hampshire between Maggie Hassan and whoever the Republicans end up nominating, whether or not that's Chuck Morse or Donald Boldeau. Hassan is still doing pretty well in the polls. She has led in basically all of them over the last 4 months, and so she is on track to winning her re-election. Polls in New Hampshire have not been known to be that inaccurate, especially in midterm years. Of course, in 2020, Jean Shaheen won her re-election to a 4th term by a solid margin against Corky Messner. So I don't think Democrats are going to struggle too much here, and since we do not know the nominee, the state of New Hampshire is going to be a lean Democratic state. That's basically what the polling average comes out to, and this is the only major election that we do not know who the 2 nominees are going to be yet. And moving on to North Carolina, we have the election between Shirley Beasley and Ted Budd. Beasley is actually performing much better than I had originally expected. She's only down in the polls by 0.3% and actually led in the 2 most recent polls between the 2 candidates. And Democrats have not won a Senate or presidential election in the state since all the way back in 2008, with the election of Barack Obama on the presidential level and Kay Hagan for the Senate election. And of course, Hagan, 6 years later in 2014, was immediately defeated by Tom Tillis, who also won re-election in 2020 against Cal Cunningham. It was a very close race. Democrats poured tens of millions of dollars into this election, and they still ended up losing. Of course, Joe Biden also lost in the state to Donald Trump by a smaller margin of 1.3%. So yes, Democrats are doing pretty well in the state compared to where they were 2 decades ago, but definitely they're not going to win in 2022. That just is not going to happen. The national environment, yes, it may favor Democrats, but with Joe Biden's approval rating, it's almost impossible that they lose North Carolina in 2020 and win it this time around. So North Carolina, according to the polls, is going to go to the Republicans with a lean margin, but I do believe that it's going to be much larger than that in the election in November. In the election in Georgia, Warnock is up by 2.7% against Herschel Walker. This is the 3rd out of the 3 major targets for the GOP this year, the other 2 being Nevada and Arizona, the 2 races that we already looked at. And I mean, Democrats are doing pretty well in both of these races, especially in Arizona, and things are not looking good for the GOP in Georgia either, with their candidate down by 2.7%, and polls in Georgia have been famously known to be very, very accurate. And if you look at the governor election here, Brian Kemp is up by 5%, so it is not Democrats doing well in the Senate election or Democrats doing well in the state overall. It simply is Herschel Walker doing terribly. We're going to see a lot of vote splitting where Georgia voters vote for Brian Kemp on the gubernatorial level, but Raphael Warnock for re-election on the Senate level, and Warnock is positively approved of in the state despite Joe Biden having an approval rating in the 30s. So the Biden effect is not as powerful as many Republicans would have hoped, and so according to the polls right now, Georgia is going to be a lean Democratic state. I think that right now Democrats can at least hold on to 2 races in the 3, including Nevada, Arizona, and Georgia. Of course, the 3 major targets for the GOP this November, and of course that is if they can even hold on to their races in the Midwest. And finally, in Florida, you all know it's going to go to Marco Rubio, but by the smallest margin ever. Looking at the 2 most recent polls, Marco Rubio and Val Demings are actually tied. Yes, these are Democratic-funded polls, but I'm just going to go with it. In the end, Marco Rubio is probably going to win by 5 to 10%. This is a pretty interesting matchup. Democrats are probably not going to do well in a Florida election in a pretty long time, but Val Demings is one of the most prominent Democrats in the state, and Marco Rubio is not exactly that popular. Yes, he did come in 3rd in the 2016 Republican primary, but he has distanced himself from Trump over the last couple of years. He is not that diehard of a Trump supporter, and so that is not going to energize a lot of the Republican base, but Marco Rubio definitely is still going to win his re-election, just like Ron DeSantis. And if you look at the polling average, he is only up by 3.9%. So according to the polls, Florida is actually only going to be a lean state for the GOP. So really not great for the Republicans in both North Carolina, Iowa, as well as Florida. Not both, but all of these races. Utah is not looking good for the GOP too. So as of right now, this is the 2022 Senate map based on the latest polls. 53 for the Democrats, 47 for the Republicans. I mean, definitely Democrats typically do well in polling, but I mean, this is an unprecedented level of doing well in polling. Democrats are up by double digits in both Arizona and Pennsylvania, something that simply should not be happening. And they're also leading in the contentious races in Wisconsin, Ohio, Georgia, and Nevada. And so that'll be it for this video. Of course, I do not believe Democrats are going to win 53 seats, but this is just what the polling tells us. And of course, I will keep you guys updated on this year's midterm elections on this channel. So make sure you like this video down below if you enjoyed it. Comment down below which party you think will win control of the Senate after these midterms. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't. Consider purchasing a channel membership for just 99 cents per month for extra perks. And I will see you guys in the next video.